There is a specific kind of silence that only exists between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a town sleeping. It's a heavy, expectant silence. Like the world has held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The darkness at that hour feels thick, almost physical, pressing against the windows of whatever room you find yourself trapped in. Most people are asleep, completely oblivious to the shift in reality that occurs when the rest of the world goes dark. But for those of us who live our lives in the quiet spaces of the night, we know the truth. We know that the night doesn't just harbor shadows, it harbors frequencies. Frequencies that are always broadcasting, just waiting for the right receiver to tune in. My name is Marcus. For the last 3 years, I've worked the night shift as a master control operator for a local, independent television station in upstate New York. Channel 14. We aren't a big network affiliate. We don't have a massive corporate budget, high-tech studios, or a team of overnight engineers. By midnight, our scheduled programming ends. The local news sign-off finishes playing. The paid infomercials finish rolling. And my job is simply to sit in a dark room filled with glowing monitors. I'm a glorified babysitter for a computer server. My single responsibility is ensuring the automated system transitions smoothly from late-night infomercials into the morning news broadcast at exactly 6 a.m. Most nights, it's mind-numbingly boring. The master control room is tucked deep in the basement of our old concrete studio building. It has no windows to the outside world, only the hum of massive server racks and the dull glow of a dozen display screens. To keep myself awake, I bring a book, drink stale coffee from a stained mug, and watch the blank walls. The silence of the building is absolute, broken only by the occasional clanking of the facility's outdated heating pipes. You get used to the isolation. You even start to crave it. But 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, the air in the control room changed. The ambient temperature seemed to plummet in a matter of seconds, and a sudden, inexplicable sense of being watched washed over me. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. I know the exact time because the digital master clock on the wall glows in a harsh neon green that bleeds across the console and onto the floor. I was scrolling through my phone when the main broadcast monitor, the large display showing what is actively going out over the airwaves to thousands of homes, flickered violently. Now, in modern digital broadcasting, things don't just flicker. It's all computerized. If a signal drops, the screen goes black, or it displays a static error code. It doesn't exhibit the behavior of an old cathode ray tube television, but this wasn't digital. The screen distorted heavily. Horizontal lines tore across the display, tracking violently upward, and then came the sound from the studio monitor speakers. It was white noise, but it was far too deep. It wasn't the crisp, high-pitched hiss of standard television snow. It was a low, resonant drone that vibrated directly in my chest, shaking the loose change resting on the control console. I stood up, my chair squeaking loudly against the linoleum floor, and walked over to the rack of waveform monitors to check the signal strength. According to our automated playback logs, the station was supposed to be broadcasting a low-resolution rerun of an old 1970s cooking show. But that's not what was displaying on the screen. Through the heavy, rhythmic snow of the analog static, a coherent visual shape began to form. It was a room, a completely empty, windowless room with dark, decaying wood-paneled walls, lit by a single harsh overhead bulb that swayed slightly on a frayed cord. In the center of the room sat a lone wooden chair. Nothing else. No decorations, no doors, no windows. There were no actors and no movement. It was just a completely static shot of an empty chair, filmed on what looked like deteriorating 16mm film. The grain was incredibly heavy, swimming across the screen like a colony of microscopic insects. It looked old, ancient even, but the feed was perfectly clear despite the static overlay. I figured it was a signal bleeding from a pirate transmitter. Sometimes, unique atmospheric conditions or a powerful illegal broadcast can override a weak local signal on old analog frequencies, though we had transitioned to digital years ago. Puzzled, I reached for the control console to manually override the feed and force the automation server back into the primary loop. I hit the emergency bypass button. Nothing happened. The console lights remained green, but the monitor didn't budge. Panic began to tickle the back of my throat. I reached under the desk and threw the physical breaker to cut the main transmitter power entirely. The monitor should have gone completely black, plunging our over-the-air signal into dead air. It didn't. The empty room stayed on the screen, completely unfazed by the lack of electricity running to our broadcast array. And as I stared at it, wondering if I was having a stroke or a waking nightmare, the camera angle slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to zoom in on the chair. The movement was incredibly smooth, yet glacial. It felt like it was taking hours just to cross a few feet of empty space. I stood there paralyzed for over 20 minutes, watching a camera glide forward through the electronic snow. By 3:40 a.m., the wooden chair filled the entire frame, the details of its weathered, splintering wood sharp against the background. And then, without warning, the feed cut. There was no fade out, just a sharp, jarring snap back to the brightly lit, colorful kitchen of the 1970s cooking show. The sudden burst of cheerful, highly compressed audio from the old videotape made me jump out of my skin. The master clock on the wall read exactly 3:41 a.m. I sank back into my chair, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs, sweat slicking my palms. I checked the digital logs on the server. There was absolutely no record of a signal disruption. The automated system registered a perfect, uninterrupted broadcast from midnight to 4 in the morning. If I reported this to my supervisor, they wouldn't believe me. They would think I fell asleep and had a vivid nightmare, or worse, they'd demand a mandatory drug test. So I kept my mouth shut. But the human brain is a dangerous thing. It absolutely hates an unsolved puzzle, and it loves to obsess over the things that terrify it the most. The next night I found myself waiting. I didn't open my book. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't even take a sip of my coffee. I just sat in the dim green light of the control room, staring fixedly at the neon clock as the numbers slowly rolled over. 3:12, 3:13, 3:14, right on cue. The colorful screen of the late-night infomercial dissolved into a violent spasm of black and white static. The deep, chest-rattling drone flooded the room once again. The wood-paneled room was back on the screen, but this time the chair wasn't empty. Someone was sitting in it. They were wearing a dark, oversized suit that looked decades old, the fabric dusty and ill-fitting. Their head was slumped completely forward, their chin resting heavily against their chest, while long, matted gray hair fell forward, obscuring their face. Their hands were resting flat on their knees, fingers completely straight. They were perfectly, unnaturally still. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glass of the monitor, searching for any sign of life. There was no rising and falling of the chest to indicate breathing. It looked like a corpse draped in old clothing, left to rot under the heat of the single overhead bulb. Suddenly, the figure's left hand twitched. It was just a slight, violent jerk of the fingers, but the exact moment it happened, a loud, piercing tone blasted through the control room speakers. It sounded like a standard emergency broadcast warning tone, but warped, distorted, and layered with a high-pitched metallic screech that made me clap my hands over my ears. On the screen, the figure slowly began to lift its head. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run out of the building, to leave the keys on the desk and never look back. But I was totally paralyzed by a morbid fascination. The head lifted completely. The gray hair fell away from the face, but there was no face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless mass of dark, shifting shadow. It looked like a physical hole had been torn right out of the fabric of the video itself. It wasn't a mask, and it wasn't a trick of the light. It was an absolute absence of light. A localized void that remained completely crisp and static-free, while the rest of the room vibrated with violent white noise. The entity stared directly through the camera lens, directly through the monitor screen, directly at me. By the fourth night, the broadcast had completely broken me. I had stopped sleeping during the day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the texture of that gray, swimming static burning into my retinas. I could hear that faint, low-frequency hum lingering in my apartment, even with my television turned off, even with the power breaker to my living room pulled. It had nested inside my skull. I knew I shouldn't go back to work. I called in sick for 2 shifts, but on the third night, a strange, overwhelming compulsion drew me back to the studio. I felt an irrational certainty that if I wasn't there to watch the broadcast, whatever was on the other side of that screen would come out into the real world to find me. At 3:14 a.m., the signal changed yet again. This time, the wood-paneled room was entirely gone. The camera angle was completely different. It was a wide, high-angle shot of a dark corridor. The walls were lined with metal equipment racks glowing with small green and red LEDs. My breath caught in my throat, freezing in my lungs. It was the hallway just outside the master control room. Our hallway. The video quality was still trapped in that grainy, shifting 16mm analog style, making our modern facility look like a piece of archival footage from a historic crime scene. At the far end of the hall, standing directly beneath a flickering fluorescent light tube, was the figure in the oversized suit. The faceless shadow. It began to walk toward the camera position, but its movements were entirely wrong. It didn't glide and it didn't walk with a human gait. It moved in violent jolts, skipping frames entirely like a badly edited film reel. 1 second it was 20 feet away, then a sudden glitch in the static occurred and it was 15 feet away. Another glitch and it was 10. With every skip in the video timeline, the audio hum in the control room grew progressively louder, vibrating the glass panes of the equipment racks until they rattled. The figure stopped right in front of the camera lens. The screen went almost entirely black as the void of its faceless head filled the frame. Then the camera angle shifted one final time. It was a shot from the top corner of the room, a security camera angle. It showed the master control console, the glowing green clock reading 3:32 a.m., and a young man with a pale, terrified face backing away into the equipment racks. It was a live feed of me. But on the monitor, standing directly behind me in the dark, unlit corner of the room, was the man in the suit. His long, shadowed arm was slowly rising, reaching out toward the back of my neck. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't risk seeing it with my own eyes. I threw myself forward, crashing onto the control desk, scrambling wildly in the dark for my car keys. I didn't care about the job, I didn't care about the equipment, and I didn't care about the broadcast logs. I sprinted out of the master control room, down the long, empty hallway, burst through the heavy metal emergency exit doors, and didn't stop running until I was inside my car with the doors locked and the engine roaring to life. I drove away into the night, never looking back at the glowing red tower array on the hill. I quit the next morning via a brief text message to my manager. I told them I was experiencing a sudden medical emergency and had to leave the state immediately. They didn't fight me on it, and they didn't ask for a doctor's note. In fact, my manager sounded strangely relieved on the phone, as if he knew exactly what kind of entity occupied that basement shift. I moved 3 states away to a small rural town. I took a manual job at a landscaping company, spending my days outside under the bright, open sun, as far away from broadcast equipment and dark server rooms as humanly possible. I don't own a television anymore. My apartment is entirely analog. No smart devices, no Wi-Fi networks, no screens. Just physical books and a battery-powered radio. I thought I was safe. I thought I had left that cursed frequency behind in that concrete basement in New York. But 2 days ago, I bought an old, vintage alarm clock from a local thrift store. A simple, mechanical flip clock with a built-in AM and FM radio receiver, just so I could tell the time without having to look at a smartphone screen. Last night, I woke up suddenly in the dead of night. The air in my bedroom felt freezing cold, my breath misting in the dark before me. I looked over at the clock on my nightstand. The mechanical numbers flipped forward with a soft, heavy click. 3:14 a.m. The radio didn't turn on by itself. Not exactly. The physical dial was turned completely to the off position, but from deep inside the plastic housing of the clock, vibrating through the tiny, dust-covered speaker grill came a sound. It wasn't music, and it wasn't a late-night talk show host. It was the heavy, rhythmic friction of white noise, the deep, chest-vibrating hum of an analog television broadcast, and underneath the thick layer of static, buried so deep you'd miss it if you weren't listening for your life, I heard the distinct, unmistakable mechanical click of a camera lens slowly zooming in. And then, a low, distorted voice whispered directly from the speaker. It was warped by the digital feed, but it knew exactly who I was. It said, "We're still on the air, Marcus." I haven't turned the lights off since that whisper. I'm sitting in the furthest corner of my room right now, writing these words down by hand, watching the mechanical clock flip its numbers. It's almost 3 in the morning again, and the air is starting to turn cold. If you are listening to this story right now, if you are watching a screen late at night in the quiet spaces of your home, do me a favor. Look away from the center of the video. Look at the very edges of your display screen. Look at the way the shadows are casting against the wall directly behind your monitor. Are you entirely sure you're the only one watching this broadcast? Or is something waiting patiently inside the white noise, watching you back through the static?